The most important thing happening in Taiwan right now is not a missile, not a warship, and not even a speech in Washington. It is doubt. Not abstract doubt, political doubt, strategic doubt. The kind of doubt that begins in opinion polls, moves into budget fights, spreads into industrial policy, and then slowly starts to change the way a whole society positions itself between two great powers. That is where the story begins. Not with an invasion scenario, not with a summit, not with one more television argument about whether Trump is merely being Trump. Begin instead with a quieter image. A government in Taipei trying to push through a huge new defense budget while the legislature resists. An opposition leader traveling to China for the first such visit in a decade. A public that is becoming less certain the United States would actually come if the worst happened. That is the moment to hold in your head, because the real story is not that Taiwan is suddenly moving toward China. The real story is that trust in the American guarantee is thinning at the exact moment Taiwan most needs that guarantee to feel solid. And once that trust starts thinning, every other line on the island begins to move. Defense spending, party conflict, semiconductor strategy, public psychology, China policy, everything, that is the axis. Most commentaries still ask the question too bluntly. Is Taiwan moving away from the United States? That makes it sound like Taiwan is about to make one dramatic choice and step from one camp into another. That is not how this works. What happens first in places like Taiwan is not a clean break. It is a weakening of certainty. The old anchor does not disappear overnight. It just stops feeling emotionally and politically unquestionable. And when that happens, other actors gain room, opposition parties gain room, businesses gain room, voters gain room to hedge, Beijing gains room to work the seams. That is what is happening now. For decades, the United States did not need to offer Taiwan a perfectly explicit guarantee. Strategic ambiguity worked because it rested on something deeper than formal language. It rested on a broader political feeling that America still understood Taiwan mattered, that it would not casually trade the island away, and that the larger structure of power in Asia still pointed in a recognizably stable direction. Trump's return has complicated that feeling. Formally, his position on Taiwan is not revolutionary. In some ways, it is almost a return to the old rhetorical norm. He avoids giving away secrets. He does not spell out a simple yes or no pledge in public. On paper, that is familiar. But politics is not lived on paper. Politics is lived through tone, sequencing, and the way people interpret incentives. And Trump has sent exactly the kind of signals that make Taiwan uneasy. He talks about Taiwan not only as a security partner, but as an economic rival. He says Taiwan stole America's semiconductor business. He pressures the island to shift more chip manufacturing to the United States. He demands greater defense spending. He hints through his general deal-making instincts that almost everything in foreign policy is negotiable if the price is right. That combination is corrosive because it creates what I would call an insurance problem. Taiwan is being asked to pay more for a policy whose terms feel less certain. That is the center of the whole story. If Taiwan spends more on defense, buys more American weapons, moves more of its most valuable industrial capability onto U.S. soil and still cannot feel confident about the political reliability of the American commitment, then the island is no longer simply buying protection. It is buying uncertainty at a higher premium. That is a very dangerous feeling in domestic politics, because once that feeling sets in, every argument inside Taiwan changes. Look at the polls. Distrust of the United States is up. The share of Taiwanese who see America as untrustworthy has risen sharply. The share who doubt Washington would really come to Taiwan's defense has risen too. Broader negative sentiment toward the U.S. has also increased. These are not just mood indicators, they are political raw material. They tell you that strategic trust is no longer stable. And once strategic trust becomes unstable, every domestic faction starts reorganizing around that instability. That is why Taiwan's current political crisis matters so much. The ruling DPP and President Lai are trying to push through a huge multi-year special defense budget meant to strengthen Taiwan's resilience. buy more arms, and move the island closer to the sort of defense spending level Trump wants to see. On the surface, that sounds rational enough. China is pressuring the island more. Taiwan should prepare harder. America wants allies to carry more of the burden. The logic is straightforward, but it is only straightforward if people still trust the strategic framework around it. The DPP no longer controls the legislature. The opposition KMT is stronger there, and the KMT is making a very different argument. It says the government spending plans are too expensive, too opaque, and too provocative. It says that dialogue and engagement with China can lower risk in ways militarization cannot. That is not just a budget dispute, it is a dispute over what kind of insurance Taiwan should buy when the American insurer no longer feels emotionally simple. If U.S. support felt rock solid, the argument for much higher defense spending would be easier to sell. But if Trump looks transactional, if his language makes Taiwan sound like a client being invoiced, if the island's chip industry is being partially pulled away while the protection guarantee feels less emotionally clear, then the opposition suddenly has a much stronger line. Why should Taiwan pay dramatically more for a security strategy whose ultimate underwriter feels less predictable than before? That is a brutal political question, and once it enters the system, it does not stay in one debate. It spreads everywhere. It reaches the defense budget, it reaches the chip debate, it reaches attitudes toward the U.S., it reaches attitudes toward the KMT's outreach to China. It even reaches the meaning of deterrence itself. That is why the recent KMT visit to China matters more than it first appears. A KMT leader meeting Xi Jinping for the first time in a decade is not just symbolic. It is Beijing demonstrating that it can work two tracks at the same time. On one track, pressure, military drills, intimidation, refusal to renounce force, constant reminders that China can keep raising the temperature. On the other track, inducement, meetings, open channels, restored flights, selective warmth, a message to Taiwan that not every future has to run through confrontation if the right political actors are empowered. That is sophisticated strategy. Beijing does not need Taiwan to flip to China. It only needs Taiwan to become less certain about America. That is enough to widen the island's political split. Enough to make defense budgets harder, enough to make hedging look more sensible, enough to create a society in which one party says survival requires deeper alignment with Washington, while another says survival requires reducing the chance that Beijing ever feels forced to move. And once that divide hardens, every outside power gains leverage. Washington gains leverage because Taiwan fears abandonment. Beijing gains leverage because Taiwan fears war. The KMT gains leverage because voters dislike paying more into a strategy that feels less emotionally guaranteed. The DPP gains leverage because Beijing's pressure is obviously real. No one needs an invasion for this to become dangerous. The danger is that Taiwan becomes strategically polarized under external pressure. That is also why the semiconductor issue cuts so deep. Taiwan's chip industry is not just an industry, it is part of the island's geopolitical logic. The so-called silicon shield is the belief that Taiwan's central role in global chip supply makes the world, and especially the United States, more likely to care intensely about its security. The shield is economic, but it is also psychological. When Trump pressures Taiwan to shift more semiconductor manufacturing into the United States, Taiwan hears two messages at once. The first is practical. America wants domestic capacity. The second is strategic. If enough of Taiwan's most important industrial leverage is relocated, then one of Taiwan's strongest reasons for feeling indispensable may begin to thin. That does not mean the silicon shield disappears overnight. It means confidence in the shield becomes less certain, and once confidence becomes less certain, politics becomes more volatile, because the public starts to ask hard questions. If our chips move, what remains of our leverage? If we spend more, what exactly are we buying? If America wants our industry and our money, but still speaks like a deal maker? What happens when Taiwan becomes one variable inside a larger bargain with Beijing? Those questions do not have to be answered definitively to be politically powerful. They only have to be plausible. And right now, they are plausible enough to change the atmosphere. That is why Taiwan's internal dispute is so serious. The DPP says the danger from China is rising. So Taiwan must harden faster, spend more, and align more deeply with the US. The KMT says the danger from China is rising, which is exactly why Taiwan should avoid militarization, avoid blindly following Washington, and reopen channels with Beijing where possible. Both sides are looking at the same storm. They are drawing opposite lessons from the same weakening of American certainty. That is the trap. If the defense budget remains blocked, Lassie looks weaker in Washington and less credible as a steward of deterrence. If the DPP forces a showdown, it risks deepening polarization and helping the opposition argue that the ruling party is making Taiwan pay for a strategy whose returns are less and less clear. If the KMT moves too warmly toward Beijing, it risks looking naïve or opportunistic. If Washington keeps sounding more like a creditor than a guarantor, it helps Beijing without intending to. If Beijing pushes too aggressively, it reminds Taiwan why people fear it in the first place and can push voters back toward deterrence. That is the path tree. Every actor has options, every option carries cost, and the old stabilizer, broad confidence that the United States remained the island's unquestioned strategic anchor, is weaker than it was. That is the real break. Not that Taiwan has already left the American camp, but that Taiwan's politics are now being reorganized around a growing fear that the American camp may no longer feel as certain, as selfless, or as strategically simple as it once did. That matters far beyond Taiwan because America's allies everywhere are watching the same thing. They are watching what a second Trump term does to alliance psychology. They are watching whether industrial demands, burdens, sharing demands, and deal-making instincts start to hollow out the trust that alliances depend on. They are watching whether being useful to America still guarantees clarity or whether usefulness now just means being asked to pay more while uncertainty grows. Taiwan is simply the place where those questions become unbearable. Because if Europe misreads Trump, it pays in policy. If Taiwan misreads Trump, it could pay in history. So, is Taiwan moving away from the US? Not cleanly, not suddenly, not yet. Taiwan is entering something more dangerous than a clean break. It is entering a phase in which more of its people doubt America. More of its politics are being organized around that doubt. And China is sophisticated enough to exploit the doubt without needing to fully resolve it. That is worse than a dramatic rupture. A dramatic rupture would be obvious. This is strategic drift, slow, politically messy, easy to underestimate. Hard to reverse once it becomes the new atmosphere. And that is why the most important story in Taiwan right now is not one drill, one summit, or one vote. It is the erosion of strategic trust. Because once strategic trust thins, budgets become ideology, chip factories become security arguments, opposition visits become geopolitical signals, and every outside pressure point starts reaching deeper into the island's domestic system. That is the larger truth. The real story is not that Taiwan has chosen China. The real story is that America no longer feels simple enough for Taiwan to choose without fear. And when a protector stops feeling simple, the entire system around that protector starts to move.